Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone one more minute to hop on if they're not already logged on here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, good morning again. This morning's webinar is on the subject of ISO 45001-2018, which is a new standard, previously OSAS 18001-2007. So the webinar will focus on the changes surrounding this new standard, and we'll talk a little bit about the transition process and the audit process. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PGR. Thank you for joining me this morning. We have a brief agenda here on the screen. We'll talk about the certification process. Like I said, what are some of the benefits? What does the transition process look like for clients who will transition from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001? We'll spend the majority of our time talking about the changes in the standard. So we'll cover the key changes at a high level, and then we'll spend some time doing more of a clause by clause review. We'll talk about some other related items that are changing simultaneously. We will look at what the certification process looks like for anyone who's pursuing certification for the first time. And at the end, we'll save some time for questions. So go ahead and type those into your question section on the webinar toolbar whenever you think of a question, and we'll save them for the end of the presentation. PGR is a leading registrar. This is not an all-inclusive list, but gives you an idea of some of the countries where we have certified clients in various standards. And we're accredited to grant certification for a variety of standards. We are pursuing accreditation for ISO 45001, and once that process is finished, we will be able to conduct audits to the new standard. In general, some of the benefits of getting certified, having a management system and setting up the framework to meet the requirements of the standard helps an organization to identify and meet their legal requirements. Just going through the process of meeting the requirements in the standard and setting up the documentation or the operational controls around those criteria forces you to go through the process of identifying what, in this example, legal requirements are applicable to your organization and how you're going to ensure compliance with those requirements. Certification to a health and safety standard also can improve the organization's health and safety performance, providing a safer environment in which to do business for their employees, for their visitors, guests, contractors, neighbors, anyone who would be affected by their health and safety performance. A standard like this also often encourages management commitment and employee engagement, again, through going through the process of meeting the requirements of the standard, where management commitment and employee engagement are stressed. There are business management benefits related to meeting stakeholder requirements, potentially improving the public image of the organization, achieving strategic objectives the organization may have identified, and it's able to be integrated with other business management systems. Some organizations have a similar environmental management system that sort of mirrors the health and safety requirements. Similarly, there are quality management systems that are easily integrated as well. Those are just a few examples. Certification to a health and safety standard can also help drive improvements or changes to supplier performance. Having the certification can provide a competitive advantage over competitors or other organizations who may not have this certification. Minimizing the risks associated with the organization's activities or products is a byproduct of going through the certification process or setting up the management system, and that also can minimize production delays and other setbacks like that. And there can be other financial benefits besides minimizing production delays or things like that. Some clients or organizations report cost savings on their insurance premiums for having this certification. So there can be different financial benefits. And again, providing a competitive advantage may elicit some financial benefits as well if you're able to obtain contracts with clients that maybe you could not achieve before. ISO 45001 specifically, all of the items we addressed on the previous slide, at a high level, you are committing to occupational health and safety, preventing injuries and ill health like we discussed, providing a safer work environment, reducing risks and hazards for employees and contractors, the public image that we discussed, as well as having a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. So again, ISO 45001-2018 replaces OSAS 18001-2007. So it's been a while since the standard was revised, and it's also becoming an ISO standard. So it will match the format of the ISO standards. If anyone's familiar with the changes that recently took place with ISO 9001 or ISO 14001, this will be in a similar format. This standard defines the requirements for an occupational health and safety management system, also known as an OHSMS. And this is a framework that allows the organization to control its hazards, reduce risks, injuries, ill health, and downtime, and continually improve its processes and operations. It was published in March of 2018, and this is a voluntary certification. Some organizations may have customers that require they hold this, or some companies, such as in the recycling industry, if you have the R2 standard, you're required to have either environmental health and safety management systems, one of which could include previously OSAS 18001 and will now be ISO 45001. But generally, it is a voluntary certification. So for clients who will be transitioning, again, the publication date was March 2018, and there will be a 3-year transition period. So if you are currently certified to OSAS 18001, there is a 3-year transition period. PGR will issue a transition plan for existing OSAS 18001 clients to offer information about the transition or any deadlines that may be put in place by PJR to maintain this transition deadline, because any OSAS 18001 certificates will expire, if not before, at the end of this transition period. So PJR will communicate a transition plan about when to have your audit take place in order to avoid a lapse in certification. Keep in mind when we are looking to, when we draw close to that deadline, that expiration of OSAS 18001, you're not just required to have your audit take place before that deadline, you actually have to have that new certificate in hand. And there are several certification decision-making activities that take place at PJR behind the scenes after your audit occurs to ensure that happens. So not only will your audit have to take place by that deadline, any nonconformities that were issued will need to be resolved through the corrective action process. the package needs to be reviewed internally by PJR. And then once the package has been approved, it's sent to the certification department. The organization will receive a draft certificate to approve and verify that all the information is correct before the final certificate can be issued. So just keep those activities in mind. You're not going to want to schedule your audit right before that deadline. Otherwise, you're likely to have a lapse, a period of time where your OSAS 18001 certificate has expired and your ISO 45001 certificate has not yet been issued. So it's a ways away. We still have, 2.5 years, but something to keep in mind. Transition audits can occur during either surveillance or recertification audits based on the client's preference. So it's really going to depend on when you're ready to transition, when PGR gains accreditation, anytime after that you're ready to transition, whether it's a surveillance or recertification audit, we can transition you at any of those audits. However, the transition plan for ISO 45001 requires at least 1 day be added to the audit, whether it's a surveillance or recertification audit scheduled, to ensure all of the transition requirements are audited in full. So whether you're transitioning during a surveillance or recertification audit, keep in mind that your audit will be at least 1 day longer than it would normally be. And again, PGR will issue a transition plan to existing clients that will explain more about this. So I mentioned that the ISO standards are following a similar structure, and that's called the Annex SL. Here's a brief overview of what that looks like. So all the clause numbers are the same, the titles of the clauses are the same, and they have a lot of terms in common. So some of you may recognize this, like I said, from some of the other standards that have recently changed. See some slight revisions to the Plan, Do, Check, Act model within the standard. At a high level, the key changes in ISO 45001 are the adoption of the ISO structure, which I mentioned before. So OSAS 18001 was not an ISO standard. It had a little bit of its own format. It is now an ISO standard through ISO 45001 and will match that Annex SL structure we just discussed. ISO 45001 has a definite emphasis on leadership, and we'll talk more about these changes, but there's an emphasis on leadership in terms of accountability, knowledgeability, responsibility of the leadership team. There's a focus on risk management and proactivity, an emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change. Some changes around communication and awareness. And even though there are changes to the standard and some additional considerations, overall, the standard is thought to be less prescriptive, giving organizations a little bit more flexibility in how they implement the requirements of the standard in a way that best fits their organization. These terms can be found within the standard. I'm not going to go through all of these, and you can also review them in more detail when you, if you would like to download a copy of the slides or the presentation after the presentation is over. That will be uploaded to PGR's website within the next few days. But I did highlight in the slides some of the key terms or key term changes. Interested party is an important term in the new Annex SL structure of these ISO standards, so take a close look at that. Intended outcomes is important as well. The intended outcomes of the OHSMS being preventing injury and ill health for workers and providing a healthy workplace. So there's a lot of emphasis on the management system achieving its intended outcomes versus the performance in the previous sense of the OSAS 18001 standard. The intended outcomes, whether the intended outcomes are being met or not, is a really important gauge of the effectiveness of the OHSMS. I mentioned that leadership and Their accountability is stressed, so top management is an important term, moving away from emphasis on a management representative necessarily, because in many cases it takes several individuals in an organization to meet the requirements of the standard. But even if there is a management representative or there's a team of people working on this, top management or the leadership of the organization is ultimately accountable. Risk is obviously an important concept. So like I said, take a look at these terms when you have some time. Documented information is also a change to allow greater flexibility for the organization to determine the different formats or media types where documents or records or information may be stored. This replaces documents and records in the previous versions of the standards to encompass both, again, in any format or media that may make sense for an organization. The definition for audit is a little bit more specific than it used to be. Leadership is emphasized. So for ISO 45001, like I said, there's an emphasis on leadership. It has its own clause and everything now, and we'll talk about that. There's also strategic planning, which is, again, speaking to the knowledgeability and involvement and accountability of the leadership team, in that the strategic planning of the organization should be aligned with the OHSMS. I mentioned earlier that there is an emphasis on proactivity. The expectation for organizations is really that they'll be proactive in their approach to identifying and managing risks. And what that means is being able to identify the potential for risks and put operational controls in place to prevent those risks more often or with greater importance than reacting to an injury, an incident, a near miss that has occurred that kind of makes it clear that there's a risk that's uncontrolled. And obviously when that happens, you take steps to control that risk. However, ideally, in going through the exercises in implementing this management system, you can really be proactive and identify most, if not all, of those risks prior to an incident occurring. And that can be in several areas related to hazard identification, risk assessment, emergency response or controls, operational controls, monitoring and measurement. It's really just taking a proactive approach to protecting the employees and the other affected parties. I mentioned that there's a shift from focusing on a continual improvement, which was in the previous version of the standard, to improving the health and safety performance of the management system, which again goes hand in hand with the intended outcomes of the system. There's some additional requirements related to communication, which we'll talk about. And when we were looking at the definitions, I mentioned how documented information is a term that encompasses documents and records to allow greater flexibility for the organization. Okay, so we will go through some of the clauses that have the most changes or the most significant changes. Clause 4 includes the context of the organization, which relates to, in part, intended outcomes. So determining the issues that are relevant to the OHSMS and the system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. That is part of the organization's context. It's also important to determine the relevant needs of interested parties, not just employees or stakeholders. There are several examples of interested parties that may be relevant to the organization. So identifying who those interested parties are and what their needs and expectations might be as they translate most often to requirements of the management system. The scope of the management system should consider all of these things. Clause 5, as I mentioned, leadership is its own section in the standard now. It's really emphasized. Top management needs to be responsible for the effectiveness of the management system, its integration with other business practices, the allocation of resources to ensure those are adequate, and communication on many levels, but related to the conformance of the OHSMS. The policy should be aligned with the organization's strategic direction and achieve the system's intended outcomes, which is a term that we talked about earlier. And the policy should include a commitment to participation, and that may be slightly different than the verbiage used in the previous version of the standard. When it comes to roles and responsibilities, as I mentioned, a management representative is not emphasized as much anymore, that you won't find the term explicitly mentioned in the ISO 45001 standard. The emphasis is more on top management's responsibility to allocate resources, ensure the resources are sufficient, that responsibilities have been assigned. So the responsibilities can be delegated. It doesn't have to be, one person or only top management. They can be delegated, but ultimately it's top management that is accountable for the OHSMS. So they should be involved, they should be knowledgeable, and this will be relevant to the audit process when you are transitioning or once you are being audited to ISO 45001. Top management will be relevant to the audits so that we can gauge as auditors how involved they are, how accountable they are. Clause 5.4 contains more specific requirements related to participation and consultation criteria. I've listed some examples here. Training requirements, identifying and removing, if possible, obstacles to participation. So if you're not getting a good amount of participation, looking closely at why that may be and what can be done to address those issues. Sometimes there is, for example, a fear of reprisal, and that's where employees are concerned about raising concerns or complaints or bringing information to the management team for fear of getting in trouble or having some other negative impact to them. Sometimes there are language barriers. There could be a variety of issues there. Also emphasizing non-manager participation. So we're not just looking for the managers or the team leads, the people that are usually participating, looking at non-manager roles as well. All employees can be helpful in identifying risks and hazards in the areas in which they work every day. Clause 6 has been entirely restructured. This is the planning clause. Planning and risk determination must take into consideration both the positive and the negative. So this is risks and opportunities, both the positive and negative. So we're not only looking at negative risks or impacts, positive ones are relevant as well. The issues identified and the needs and expectations of interested parties. And we talked about these in clause 4. So all of these are relevant again when we're talking about risk determination or the planning of the OHSMS. And again, as we discussed earlier, there's a focus on those intended outcomes versus just the more general continual improvement expectations of OSAS 18001. 6.1 specifically is actions to address risk and opportunities. So ensuring that the OHSMS can achieve its intended outcomes, preventing those undesirable effects, injuries, ill health, all the things that we're trying to prevent through this OHSMS, and to continually improve. So planning out these actions, identifying the risks to ensure these can be met. And risks and opportunities can be related to the health and safety hazards. They could also pertain to legal or other requirements, or risks and opportunities in general that could have an impact on those intended outcomes of the organization. Hazard identification is a bit more prescriptive, and again, with an emphasis on proactivity, to really consider what those hazards could be. Kind of thinking outside the box maybe in this area, trying to broaden the scope to items that might not have been considered in the past. People working in a nearby area who can be affected by the organization. People at the workplace but not controlled by the organization. So this could be if temps are utilized, but temps are controlled by the temp agency. This is sometimes an area where controls are not as effectively implemented, or risks are not as effectively identified because they're not as clearly under the control of the organization itself. Could be contractors who are on site doing work, could be visitors, but they're still potentially affected by the OHSMS, and it is relevant. Work area and equipment designs are relevant. Actual or proposed changes affecting the OHSMS related to change management is very much relevant. Past incidents can identify areas of potential risk or insufficient controls. Those are just a few examples, but again, trying to think maybe outside the box a little bit and see if any areas might have been missed in the past. The organization needs to have a process to assess the OHS risks with established criteria, and documented information is required to be retained about how this is done, what the process is, as well as evidence of implementation. Similarly, the same goes for OHSMS opportunities, so risks and opportunities. These really go hand in hand. So again, looking at both the positive and the negative. 6.1.3 covers the determination of legal and other requirements. So keeping this up to date and accessible, all of the applicable requirements, determining how the requirements apply to the organization and to the organization's specific risks, what communication requirements might be related to those legal and other requirements, such as reporting injuries, consideration in maintaining and improving the OHSMS. So legal and other requirements is one area where we can see risks or opportunities, or both, be identified as well. And then once we've determined all of those items, we need to be planning action accordingly to address those risks, opportunities, legal and other requirements, emergency situations, all of that good stuff. And the hierarchy of controls that was found in 18,001 is still in effect. There's a hierarchy of controls which can be found in clause 8.1.2 that really highlights the preference or the order or the different tiers of operational controls. So for example, first and foremost, if you have identified a risk and it can be completely eliminated, that would be the first choice. And then there are other levels within the hierarchy, such as machine guarding, personal protective equipment, documented procedures and training, things like that. It really just depends on the risk and some of the other details around what that risk represents and how it can be controlled. 6.2 covers objectives. And again, the objectives and targets are geared towards improving the OHSMS. This isn't very different from the previous version. We're looking for consistency with the policy, taking into consideration the legal and other requirements, the risks and opportunities, participation and consultation results. So what have the employees, for example, brought forward as concerns or areas that could be improved. The objectives need to be monitored and measured if possible. They need to be communicated and they need to be maintained or updated as relevant. In planning the objectives, you also, as an organization, are required to determine and have documented information as evidence of what tasks are going to be needed to achieve the objective, what resource needs are required, who's responsible for those objectives or those tasks, what are the completion timelines or deadlines, how will this be monitored, what are the results of the evaluations throughout the process, things like that. All of that needs to be planned out and documented. In clause 7, we move on to the clause for support. This talks about competency and awareness requirements, which have been separated into 2 separate sections with more awareness criteria prescribed by the standard. External representation and reporting needs to be controlled, and communication needs to be considered widely. And this section also talks about the documented information with respect to controlling documents and records and managing those various types of media. So 7.2 is the competence clause specifically. So as before with OSAS 18001, the organization is required to determine the competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the OHSMS. So again, we're focusing on intended outcomes and their ability, the employees' ability to affect the performance may vary by job or work area. So that can be relative compared to their effect on the OHSMS and its intended outcomes. And the competency has to be evidenced through documented information. So not only do you need to determine what the competency requirements are, you need to be able to prove the competency has been identified or confirmed or verified in some way. And this goes hand in hand with taking any necessary actions to close those gaps on competency. If you've identified a competency requirement and the person in that role or heading into that role does not meet those competency requirements, it's up to the organization to bridge that gap, obtain the necessary competencies for that individual, and there would be documented information as evidence of that, and then evaluating the effectiveness of those actions to determine whether competency has been obtained. Seven point 3 covers awareness. And as I mentioned, this is a bit more prescriptive than in the previous version of the standard because it identifies specific items the workers need to be aware of, what the organization needs to be communicating and making them aware of, including the real or potential ramifications of deviating from the requirements of the OHSMS. So they really need to understand the impact that not following the OHSMS requirements or the operational controls or the procedures or the training could have. So why are they being asked to do these things? No significant changes to the internal communication requirements of the standard. External communication is a little bit more specific, requiring the organization to determine what information is relevant to be communicated, how that needs to be communicated, to whom, at what frequency, or when would something need to be communicated. And the interested parties need to be considered. So what their requirements are, what their communication expectations would be, what they're looking to hear more about is all expected to be considered. There are specific control requirements related to documented information, creating, updating, and controlling that documented information, similar to the concept of document and record control from OSAS 18001. It's just, again, using the term documented information to give organizations more flexibility for what that looks like for them. Clause 8 talks about operational controls and planning. So in general, there need to be planned actions for established process criteria with enough documented information as evidence of those processes, those process criteria being met. I mentioned earlier 8.1.2 is where you can find the hierarchy of controls. There really are no significant changes to this section. I just want to highlight where that can be found for anyone who's not familiar with that section. And 8.1.3 is the management of change clause, which is a new clause. It's not a new requirement. It was in OSAS 18001. It was implied in several areas, and now it's more clearly stated in its own clause. This management of change concept is a process that's been implemented for controlling changes that could affect the OHS performance of the organization, reviewing or mitigating any negative impacts of those changes. So you're really planning in advance what changes you plan to make to determine proactively what those risks are, what could change related to the OHSMS by making that change, what controls need to be revised, what procedures need to be put in place, really going through the whole process of proactively identifying and controlling those risks before you've even implemented that change. So again, similar to when we were talking about identifying the risk before an incident or an injury occurs, instead of making a change, such as bringing in a new piece of equipment or running a new product with raw materials you've never used before, and then dealing with the consequences or the fallout of making those changes, the expectation is that you're planning in advance, you're discussing what the proposed changes are, and determining all the effects or risks associated with those changes to plan and control prior to implementing the change. There are some procurement requirements for controlling outsourced processes that could affect the OHSMS or the intended outcomes or their performance. Similarly, contractors, identifying and controlling the risks related to the activities of contractors. Again, this is regardless of whether they're under the organization's control or not. It could still be relevant to the OHSMS performance and needs to be considered. And this could include criteria for contractor selection and other processes required to ensure that the contractor's activities as they're being performed are still meeting the requirements of the OHSMS. Similarly, there should be controls related to outsourcing procured materials or services to, again, make sure they're meeting the OHSMS requirements and intended outcomes. There are a few additional items related to emergency preparedness and response to be considered or included in the response plan, including reviewing and revising, if needed, those procedures after drills or emergencies have occurred. Sometimes in doing a drill or responding to an emergency, you identify issues or changes that need to be made, risks that weren't captured previously, and those are expected to be taken into consideration after they've been identified to improve the process. Relevant training, first aid, the needs and capabilities of all relevant interested parties involved. So make sure you've considered everyone that could be affected by those emergencies and you've taken into consideration all of their needs. Clause 9 covers performance evaluation, including monitoring and measurement. Again, not incredibly different from OSAS 18001, but the organization needs to determine what relevant monitoring and measurement requirements are in place and how they'll be evaluated for effectiveness. The internal audit program this section identifies specific factors to be determined or considered within the audit program, and it also requires that the results of the internal audits be reported to relevant managers, workers and their representatives, and other interested parties as relevant. And this goes back to the communication piece as well, really communicating more of the information about the performance and the intended outcomes of the OHSMS. In clause 9.3, there are a few additions or changes to the input and output requirements for management reviews. And remember that this is to be performed by top management. So again, we see that emphasis on their involvement and their accountability with the OHSMS. Clause 10, in terms of changes to Clause 10 related to improvement, 10.1 requires the identification of opportunities for improvement. Incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions are required to be addressed in a timely manner. So you don't want to have incidents or nonconformities or corrective actions that are sitting open for an extended period of time. And corrective actions also need to be reviewed for effectiveness with evidence, documented information to show that this was done. And again, the results are to be communicated to relevant parties, workers, interested parties. It depends. So however it's relevant, but communicating this information, again, is emphasized. .3 covers continual improvement. Again, there's a shift in this focus, but continual improvement is still required in terms of improving the OH and S performance, maintaining a culture that supports the OHSMS, encouraging participation to drive improvement, communication to relevant individuals, as we've already discussed, and maintaining evidence through documented information of the actions and improvements that have been made. At the back of ISO 45001, there is an annex including guidance on the use of the document and a bibliography, which we're not going to cover. So those are the key changes to the standard. There are a couple other related changes I want to quickly go through before we stop for questions. So there are a couple of IAF mandatory documents that came out around the time of ISO 45001 or are related to the switch to ISO 45001. And most of those requirements are specific to certification bodies, but there are a couple requirements in those documents that will trickle down to our clients, the organizations that are pursuing certification to ISO 45001. So that's what I really want to communicate in these slides. So for example, any significant changes that are made within the organization, PGR needs to be notified in writing very soon after, as soon as possible, really. In most cases, we see clients wait until their next audit to update us on the significant changes that have taken place. However, sometimes that impacts the audit time, the scheduling of the audit, the length of the audit planning process. So we really need to be notified as soon as possible of any significant changes that occur within the organization. There is a prescribed audit timetable, which calculates audit time based on the risk level and the employee count. And this is changing with these documents. So you may see an increase in audit times related to these audit timetables, which PJR and other certification bodies are required to utilize. Let's see, with an emphasis on top management and their involvement and engagement, we'll be looking for their involvement within the audits as well, as I mentioned earlier. So for example, the closing meeting is a really important part of our audit process where we go over the audit, all the findings, any opportunities for improvement or concerns, or really just the overall outcome of the audit. And it's important for top management to be involved in that. Going hand in hand with top management accountability, they should be in attendance for the closing meeting. And if not, we'll be documenting why they weren't able to attend to get a sense of their level of engagement and accountability. So that's something to keep in mind when these audits are being scheduled as well. Certification bodies like PJR may conduct special audits in response to compliance issues or incidents, and may even be required to suspend or withdraw certification depending on what has occurred. And that is explained in the terms and conditions of the contract that you would sign with PJR. Any legal compliance violations or gaps could impede the certification process. That's something to keep in mind as well. Really, the overall tone of these documents is raising the bar for the expectations of performance for the company's, the organization's OHSMS. So really briefly, for anyone who is not transitioning from OSES 18001, who is new to the certification process and looking to be certified to ISO 45001 for the first time, I just want to briefly go through the certification steps. So what this looks like is you want to start by obtaining the standard and establishing your OHSMS documentation to meet the requirements of the standard. You'll want to train to those requirements and implement those requirements, including conducting an internal audit, compliance evaluation or review, and a management review of the system, including the internal audit outputs. So you'll want the management review to take place after those audits occur. You'll contract with a certification body like PJR to conduct your audits, and the audits will be scheduled and completed. We have a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit that takes place before certification, and we'll talk about those more in a minute, but any nonconformities identified in the stage 2 need to be addressed before a certificate can be issued. So the stage 1 and stage 2 audit are two separate audits. Stage 1 is a documentation review, essentially to assess whether the framework, that documented information, the processes, the framework of those processes is in place to meet the requirements of the standard. So do those documents and that documented information meet the standard verbiage? It's really evaluating whether or not the organization is ready for their stage 2 audit or not. The stage 2 audit would take place after the stage 1 audit, and it would be an audit of the entire management system, all of the processes, all of the shifts, really the entire system. Any nonconformities identified would need to be resolved before a certificate could be issued. After that certificate is issued, they're good for 3 years. So the 3-year cycle would include surveillance audits and another recertification audit. Your surveillance audits can be annual or semi-annual depending on your contract. And those are not full system audits, those are partial system audits where we cover a sampling. Then that 3rd year would be your recertification audit again, Very similar to the stage 2, really identical in that we cover all of the processes and that it results in certificate issuance to begin that 3-year cycle again. I've included some information here about multi-site certification. In some cases, we see more than one location be covered by one certificate, which would be can be considered a multi-site. And it really just depends on the relationship between those other sites. Some organizations choose to individually certify their various locations, so there are some pros and cons to that, which you can review if that's relevant to you. To integrate those audits, the ISO 45001 audits with other standards such as ISO 14001 is also an option. There are some discounts associated with integrating versus having 2 completely separate audits, but there are criteria that need to be met. So again, feel free to review these slides if this is relevant to you once they've been made available on PGR's website. I want to take a minute to see if we have any questions. And while I do that, I'm going to put our contact information up on the screen. So if you have any additional questions about anything we've talked about today, or some specific questions you want to talk about offline, here is my contact information, Austin Matthews. We also have Nancy Bednars, who is the EHS program manager. She can be contacted with questions. And if you're looking to get a quote or sign a contract with PJR, I've included the sales department information as well here. So let's just see if we have any questions. I don't see any. If you're typing, I'll hang on for another minute or so. But in case there are no questions, thank you for joining me today. Feel free to contact me by email or phone if you do think of questions later. And I'd encourage you to take a look at the slides on PJR's website, either through just downloading the slides, or you can find a recording of today's webinar on the PJR website as well, and that may answer some of your questions as well. So I still don't see any questions, so thank you so much for joining us today. I hope I've given you a good overview of ISO 45001. Good luck with your transition or audit processes coming up, and have a great day.